Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. You know, we've done some stories lately that haven't been maybe quite as happy, as uplifting, as optimistic. So we're going to continue that trend tonight with a conversation that we're excited to present. And this is hopefully going to be the first conversation of a couple, because the body of work that we're going to be talking about tonight is not small. Let's go with. We're going to be talking about Energi. We're going to be talking about the future of Alberta's oil and gas industry, and I am extremely excited to welcome to the show the person that we're going to be talking about it with, Markham. See, I was thinking about the last name, and I managed to screw up the first name. Markham Hislop. Markham, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nate, I can tell you that over the years, you are not the first person to have done that. But thank you very much for having me.
I was super focused on making sure that I got the pronunciation of the last name as close to Ewan McGregor as I could. And I took my eyes off the first part of the ball, so I apologize for that.
Well, you know what I've done since we started doing Zoom interviews with global energy experts in about August of 2019, I think was our first one. I've done probably 1,500 of these things. So imagine how many times that I've screwed that up, just like you did. No big deal.
You got to go with the monosyllabic names like Nate, Pike. The worst someone's going to do is Nick. I can roll with that, but it makes it just easier. But we're digressing crazily. So let's get into what we're here to talk about. But before we do, I'm a big believer that context is always kind of king. So before we get into the subject matter, I'd love to hear a little bit about the subject matter expert that we're accessing tonight, you, sir. Who is Markham Hislop? Nailed it.
Well, where do I start? You want to start, back in Saskatoon in March of 1950? No, of course you don't want to do that. Nobody needs to know that information. I'm a prairie boy, Nate. I've lived in British Columbia for the last 13 years, but I was born in Saskatoon, raised in Manitoba, came back to Saskatoon to go to do a couple of degrees at the University of Saskatchewan. I've spent probably 11 or 12 years in Alberta, living in Calgary, down in big shout out to Mackenzie Town in the southeast of Calgary, where we hung our hat and thoroughly enjoyed our time there. And all the time that we've been in BC, I've been covering Alberta news and energy news, and I generally go back on a regular basis because my daughter and her family are still there. In fact, this is crazy, Nick. I know almost nothing about the city I live in, Parksville on Vancouver Island. When we lived in White Rock, I knew very little about what was going on there. But you want to ask me about Alberta politics? I have that nailed, because thanks to social media, and because of the interviews I do all the time and the reading that I do, I'm deeply my head lives in Alberta, but my body's in British Columbia.
Now, I want to get into a little bit. You've talked about the fact that you cover in the news for a while. You talked about the fact that you cover Energi. That's a pretty niche little area of discussion. What got you interested into covering Energi, and how have you been doing it? I want to hear that story.
Well, now we will go back to my childhood. We moved from Saskatchewan to Manitoba. My dad got a job with Manitoba Hydro in Thompson, and he worked on a little hydro station called Kelsey that supplied the Thompson nickel mine with power. And then in 1971, when I was 12, we moved up to Gillam, which is a little, if you know it at all, you know it because a couple of years ago, you remember those two kids in BC that shot one or two people and then they ran away to northern Manitoba and then they found them dead in the bush. Well, that's where I grew up, was in that little town where they found those guys. But what is there? The Nelson River runs right by it, and the Nelson River is an amazing river. It's one of these huge, powerful kind of, you put hydro dams on it. And my dad was the maintenance supervisor at Kettle Rapids, which was the first one. And then I don't know how much you know about power sector, Nate, but when if I remember correctly, you generate it in AC and then you have to convert it to DC to transmit it long distances. So I worked when I was started 16, I was in high school. My first summer job, I worked for the hydro in the converter station. Did that for a couple of years, worked after high school for a year for Manitoba Hydro, went west, and my next foray into the energy industry was 2003 to 2008, when my wife Joanne is a partner in Energi Media and a former TV news shooter and editor, video editor and shooter. And so we had a little business in Calgary where we were doing marketing videos, promo, industrial kind of videos. And one of our clients who was and they made, this is, nobody will know this. And I'll be shocked if you know this, Nate. They made boronized tubing out in the Foothills Industrial Park in Calgary. There is a shop that makes the only boronized downhole oil and gas tubing in the world. And it was developed by a Calgary guy named Fred Chinsky. And it's amazing stuff. And, one of those great innovations that comes out of the oil and gas industry. So anyway, we were doing this work for them, and he said, hey, I need somebody to be a part-time sales, marketing, business development kind of guy. And it was really slow in Calgary at that time. So I put up my hand and I said, I'll do that. And I think that was in August. And a couple of months later, they said, hey, we need somebody to go down to Midland, Texas, and, kind of talk to our, see if we can get, some support down there, develop a distribution network. And I said, I'll do that. And I got on the plane, went down to Texas, and spent the better part of 2 years in Midland, kind of working in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico in the Permian Basin. Learn the oil and gas business. Now I got to tell you, if you don't know anything about the oil and gas industry, and you go down and you hang out and you talk to Texans, you present to Texans about oil and gas technologies and what's going on, a mile or two down below the surface of the earth in their wells. That's an experience I don't recommend. But I'll tell you, and this kind of stood me in good stead when I picked up my journalism career again in 2008, and that is, you never lie. If you don't know, you don't know, you say you don't know, right? Because a Texan will pick up on that and chew your hiney off, I tell you. So you don't lie, and you just say, look, I don't know, man. I'm going to go, but I know somebody who does. I'm going to go find that out. And so that was a good lesson for 5 years. Then I went over to Bakersfield, California, and worked on the coast in Ventura and down in LA and places like that. And it was a lot of fun. Worked in Calgary, doing that kind of stuff in downtown Calgary with talking to engineers. So that's how I got to know this industry. It's not at the top, but from the bottom, out in the field, out in the regional offices. I cannot tell you, when I talk about engineering culture, my observations come from talking to hundreds and hundreds of oil and gas engineers across their desk from them. Oh, I got to tell you, Nate, what do you think hangs on the wall of many, many, many West Texas oil and gas engineers? Take a wild guess. What do you think hangs on their wall?
I would go with a Big Bang Theory poster, but I'm not in that circle.
Oh, you have no idea how far off you are. Some representation, some image of John Wayne. I have seen black velvet John Waynes, pencil drawing John Waynes, paint by number John Waynes. I've seen it all. And I asked a buddy of mine one time, I said, what is it with you guys and John Wayne? And he said, well, that's the epitome of manhood for a Texas man. That's why you see that. Okay, then. Well, now I know. And doesn't that explain a lot of what we see down in Texas?
So I got to ask then. I mean, I have two questions out of the gates just based on what you finished explaining there. My first question is, who wins in a fight, a Velvet Elvis or a Velvet John Wayne?
Oh, it depends whether it's 50s Elvis or fat Elvis.
We're gonna go 50s.
And then which John Wayne? I mean, look, I think personally, I'm not a big John Wayne fan. The guy was kind of a closet racist, and but nevertheless, I would say that even fat John Wayne would give 50s Elvis a pretty good run for his money.
There we go. I mean, Elvis was in the army though, or Air Force. He was in the military somewhere. I know that.
Nate, I remember where I was the day I saw the headline that Elvis died. There you go.
I don't. I got to say, the boronized tubing thing, that was, I didn't know that little energy tidbit. I thought you were going to throw down a Brie X reference, and I was getting nervous. But the boronized tubing thing, that was not something that I had any idea about.
Oh, there's a tremendous amount of technology that's been developed in Alberta around both on the conventional side, which is what boronized tubing was used for, but on also for the oil sands. I mean, that really is in many ways a technology play, right? And so you'll see on our YouTube channel, the Energy Media YouTube channel, you can see my interview with Ever Technologies, EAVOR Technologies, which is a closed loop geothermal company that's just really starting to take off. And all of their drilling technology and expertise comes out of the steam assisted gravity drainage method of extracting bitumen in the oil sands. And they've just applied it and adapted it to geothermal, hot water, and electricity production. I mean, so this is within the industry, they kind of puff themselves up and they take too much credit. They're always strutting around talking about the technology to develop, but on the other side, they don't get enough credit for it. I mean, Alberta and Calgary in particular, if we're talking research and development and the science behind it, that kind of thing, is an amazing place in terms of the innovation ecosystem for energy there. It's kind of not an untold story, but it doesn't get told well enough or often enough.
The reason why I wanted to have you flesh some of that out is because I think it's important to make it clear for the conversation that we're going to have tonight. You're not an anti-energy guy. You're not an anti-oil and gas guy. That's not where the thrust of this conversation is coming from for you. Is that a fair statement?
Well, it is, unless you're talking to Brett Wilson.
Well, I try not to.
Well, I think that's true for all of us, and I've muted him on Twitter for a number of years now. But guys like Brett, who are the hard-bitten oil bros that you see on social media, you see in the industry, they complain that I'm, Rachel Curran, who is the former, Prime Minister Stephen Harper's chief of staff, once out of the blue, doesn't even know her from a hole in the ground, called me a radical eco-terrorist who wanted to destroy the Alberta oil and gas industry. Couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. But here's where I do differ from the oil bros and the the Calgary Petroleum Club crowd. The oil and gas status quo is about to have a stake driven through its heart by the energy transition. And I'll tell you where my interest in energy transitions came from. When I was doing my graduate work at the University of Saskatchewan in the mid 80s, I wasn't a farm boy, but I was really interested in technology and business. So the title of my thesis was The Transition from Horses and Steam to Power Farming Technology, or to Power Farming in Saskatchewan, 1900 to 1930. And essentially, it was the transition from mostly horses and then steam tractors for threshing to tractors, and then in the mid-20s, the combines. It was really an energy transition story because the fuel that made that possible was cheap petroleum. That was the last big energy transition we had that really got kicked off was in the 20s with the switch over to oil and to gasoline and diesel. And so as part of my research, I had to read all of the technology adoption literature. So, guys like A.E. Rogers, and who came up with the whole taxonomy around early adopter, majority adopter, laggard, that sort of thing. I knew all that stuff. And so when I started our online, we've been in the online media business now for 15 years and started in Calgary in 2008. And when we started covering energy, and I began to do reporting and interviewing experts about the energy transition, I quickly realized the parallels with my graduate research that I had done. I went, aha, bingo, I know this. And so this is something I see some of it in the American energy journalists, people like David Roberts, at Canary Media. I mean, Gregor McDonald. I mean, these guys are miles ahead of most of the energy journalists we have in Canada. They know this stuff, but there's not many energy journalists left in Canada, and the few that there are generally don't know the theory behind, don't understand this. And this is a point I want to make. Probably about half of the 400 or 500 interviews that I do with experts every year are outside of Canada. And that's very deliberate, because when I talk to, whether it's academics or, utility CEOs, whoever it is, whether they're in the US or whether they're in Europe or whether they're in Asia Pacific, they have a very, very different view of the global energy transition than we do in Canada, and particularly in Alberta. And
what's different?
What's that?
What's different?
Oh, okay. In an energy transition, generally, if you think of an S, we call it the S curve. And at the bottom of that S curve, a new technology enters the market at the tail end. Or if you want to think, we're Canadians, let's think of it as a hockey stick. Okay. So at the toe of the hockey stick, it's all flat, that's where the technology enters the market. And then over the years, it creeps along and it gets better and it gets improved and it takes a little more market share and more and more and more and more and more until it gets to the heel of between the blade and the shaft of the stick. And that's called the inflection point. And at that, it's got about 5%, 7%, sometimes 10% of the market share. And at that point, it becomes competitive and it begins pushing out the old technology, and it goes zooming up that, exponential growth, hockey stick growth, right? We're all familiar with that term, hockey stick growth. And so the thing that I know that most people who talk about energy transitions don't understand is that the roots of this one are back in the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. So if you look at the first commercial solar panels, the 70s, first commercial wind turbines, the 80s, the lithium-ion battery, 1991, the first modern EV prototype, late 90s. I mean, this is all technology that's been around for 30 or 40, 50 years that government policy has primed the pump, private equity, like private capital has gone into these startup companies, like Tesla, for instance, to get, and so by the time it gets your attention and you begin to notice, hey, this is new, maybe it's, I don't know, to pick a technology, whether it's, solar panels or lithium ion batteries, whatever it is, by the time you notice it, it's because it's already now growing rapidly in the market. And I can't tell you how many times I hear like oil and gas CEOs say, yeah, that energy transition that started in 2020. No, the energy transition started like 50 years, 40 years, 30 years before. And what we're seeing now is the confluence of all, like literally thousands of clean energy technologies that have been on that S curve, the hockey stick, and they're now at the inflection point, the heel of the blade and the shaft where they meet, and now they're up on the shaft, and now they're growing incredibly rapidly. And I make this point in part 2 of the Unethical Oil series that I just published today, and that is there's a difference between linear growth and exponential growth. So linear growth, if you look at the growth of oil in Alberta over the last 30 years, it's just a nice flat, upward trend, right? It's linear. But if you look at the growth curves for electric technologies, and most importantly, technologies that are based on electronics, because that follows an entirely different law. And there's a link in today's piece to an interview I did with Mike Andrade, who's the CEO of Morgan Solar, when he explains the difference between energy as a technology and energy as a commodity. Those are two, they behave completely and utterly differently. And this is the first energy transition that has been driven by electronics and electric technologies, right? So the guy's sitting down, Brett Wilson, sitting in in the Calgary Petroleum Club, smoking his cigar and sipping on his scotch. He thinks in terms of linear growth. He's a linear growth thinker, and I've had people say this to me from the industry on social media. Energy growth has always been linear. It's always been linear. It will always be linear. They don't get it. They are the Blockbuster. They are the Eastman Kodak. They are the American newspapers of the world. And that is the dominant thinking. You see it in the government. I mean, you see it with Premier Danielle Smith. You see it with her energy ministers. Now Brian Jean, before it was Peter Guthrie, before it was Sonia Savage. They're all linear thinkers, not exponential growth thinkers. And that then permeates the energy and climate. Well, no, there is no climate policy. Sorry. That permeates Alberta's energy policy. And it's part of what breeds the conflict between Alberta and Ottawa, because you say what you want about the Liberals and about the federal government, they're more exponential growth. They get it. And those two worldviews naturally conflict. They're antithetical, they conflict. And so, that is kind of an underlying theme behind some of this conflict between Alberta and Ottawa. But anyway, so my point here is that if you're an exponential growth thinker, and you could be like Mike Andrade, you could be like Kingsmill Bond, or veteran energy economist Phil Verlager, who I interviewed recently. If you're an exponential growth thinker, you may all think that oil demand at the global level has already peaked, or will peak probably no later than 2030. And then it begins to decline into the 2030s, or maybe even before 2030. If that's the scenario we're looking at, it's not just that Alberta economy is in trouble. We're going to lose jobs. Companies are going to go bankrupt. We're going to have a bust. There's roughly $300 billion of environmental liabilities that need to be paid for. And so if we go into structural decline, not cyclical decline, where, you have a boom and a bust and a boom and a bust and a boom and a bust, and then we start slapping bumper stickers on our bumpers saying, please give me another one. I won't piss it away this time, right? The Alberta way. If we're in structural decline, there are no more booms. There are none. And so now we're looking at, how do we pay for $300 billion of environmental liabilities, and we don't have any revenue? And, if the price of oil is $40 or $50 a barrel, then the government hasn't got any money either. So who's going to pick up the tab? Or you're going to be like, Dwight Popovich, a farmer I interviewed out near Two Hills, who has a well an orphan well on his property, and he can't sell his farmland because the bank won't lend money and no one will buy it with a well that needs to be cleaned up. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of farmers and property owners all over Alberta in that same position. I mean, this thing just ripples out. If you game this out, Alberta is potentially, and in my opinion, most likely, headed for a very, very difficult time starting in the later on in this decade. So I'm not sure that's the answer you were looking for, Nate. I got on a bit of a ramble, but I hope, did I answer your question?
I don't remember what my question was, but I want to unpack some of what you just said there to make sure that I followed it along, because now we're getting into the content of your piece that you published today, which, by the way, we're recording this on July 11th. it won't be going up today because we're just having this conversation now at like 7:30. So, but for context, in case I don't know something falls out of the sky, it's July 11th when we're having this conversation. So it sounds like there's a bunch of different factors that are kind of stacked. I don't even want to say stacking. I think I feel like I have to say stacked against Alberta's future. So the first one is this exponential growth piece where we're going to see a major divergence in how energy is generated and handled. Is that a safe statement?
Well, yes, essentially we're going to we're going to electrify most of the, our transportation, our buildings, and our industry. We're going to electrify it. And what isn't electrified will be some kind of, zero or low emission fuel like hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuel, something like that.
Okay, so we're going to see a major difference in how we make the things go, but it also sounds like you're talking about electricity generation. So we're not just talking about we're going to burn, excuse me, burn propane to boil water to make turbines go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're talking about a potential shift in how that energy is even generated.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the renewables have essentially proved themselves. They're now, for instance, if you're building at the lower end of the cost curve for solar, you're probably, building at $20, $24, $22 a megawatt hour. Whereas if you're doing a natural gas combined cycle, it's double that. And if you're doing nuclear, it's probably 5 times that. And if you're the BC Hydro Site C, your costs are probably 6, 7, 8 times that. So the issue now is not whether or not renewables are going to fuel the future. The question is, how does that play out? Because right now, fossil fuels make up the same 82% of primary energy that they always have, right? I mean, what renewables are doing now is taking all the growth at the margins. So all of the whatever Latin America or Asia Pacific and where those emerging economies that are growing and industrializing and becoming more middle class, they demand huge amounts of electricity, and so the renewables are taking that share. But the IEA just came out here and said not too long ago, and I forget, we're going to see in the next few years, we're going to see as much solar added in 2 or 3 years as we did, up until 2023. And I mean, and then now we've got battery storage, and not just lithium ion. That's the thing. There's zinc ion, there's sodium ion, there's all sorts of, battery storage that's designed for stationary, where it outperforms lithium ion both on performance and on cost. And the battery and storage industry, the space is amazingly innovative. That's another thing that you don't hear, if you're just hanging around the petroleum club, is and how much China is delivering. China has become, because they invested in clean energy technology 20 years ago, and now they're seeing the benefit of that investment, and they invested in the industry to make those technologies, so the solar panels and the wind turbines and battery metals and batteries and all of that kind of thing. And why the Americans introduced the $369 billion U.S. Inflation Reduction Act last year is because I went back and I read Biden's campaign material, and it's like the Americans are setting their hair on fire. Like, they get it. This is the next industrial revolution, right? And China's winning. And financial power and economic power and military power always follows industrial power. Well, it follows economic power. Let's put it that way. And at this point in the game, that's China. That's not the US. That's China. And so the Americans, being good Americans that they are, woke up during Trump's presidency and went, holy crap. We're not number one, We're not even number 2 because that would be Europe in this emerging space, where that's going to dominate our economic growth, our industry for the next for the rest of this century. We're maybe number 3, and like good Americans, they said nope, we're going to be number 1. And so Biden says right in his campaign literature, he says by 2030 we're going to be number 1 again. And that's why you see them spending through various acts, including the Inflation Reduction Act, $1 trillion between now and 2030. So anybody who criticizes, the federal government for spending $9 billion to subsidize a battery plant doesn't realize what Canada's up against. I mean, there are only 2 ways to get this technology. Either you build it like China did, or you buy it like we're doing. There's only 2 ways you're going to get it. And so we were asleep at the switch, and we were kind of lollygagged along, and we didn't really do a lot of this work, and we don't have very much of the industry to make clean energy technology. Now this is the game. And if we want to play in that game, then we have to spend money. It's like poker, right, man? That's the table stakes. You got to ante up. Now we're doing it. And I say write the check, because that is the economy of the future. And unfortunately, and I want to make this, because we entered into the conversation by you saying, well, Markham, you're not really an anti-oil and gas guy, are you? And the answer to your question, Nate, is that I'm not an anti-oil and gas guy. I'm an anti-oil and gas status quo guy. It's the status quo part of it that I disagree with, because I've done a lot of work over the last 2 or 3 years. Where can Alberta oil and gas go? Well, we produce, there's a 10.5 million barrel a day market for heavy crude oil. And we produce about 3.2, 3.3. We are the big boys on the block when it comes to this. And we dominate the American market. But I've interviewed the scientists at the Alberta Innovates, which is Provincial Innovation Agency. And since 2016, they've been working on commercial processes to turn bitumen into carbon fiber precursor. So it turns out that bitumen, like if you look at a hydrocarbon molecule, it kind of goes like this. I mean, it's a very simple molecule, right? But if you look at a bitumen molecule, it's like a sheet, and it's got all sorts of hydrogen and carbon atoms on it. And when it's a sheet, you can take that molecule and you can manipulate it to make materials. Materials, Nate. You remember, do you ever watch The Graduate, where Dustin Hoffman gets out of the pool and his Mr. Robinson says to him, plastics, the future is plastics. Well, I'm telling you, Nate, the future is materials, advanced materials. And carbon fiber is only one of them. And bitumen is a wonderful, an amazing resource to make materials. We should stop burning this stuff. We should be making stuff with it. And the Alberta Innovates did a white paper a couple of years ago, and they said, okay, let's assume that you get the oil sands producers get $30 a barrel, because prices were in the toilet then. And what would we get if we made something out of it? Like if we made carbon fiber. So that instead of $30 a barrel, you get $217 a barrel.
That sounds like a better return on investment.
Well, it gets better. Bear with me here. So I was doing an article for Alberta Views in 2021. And so I interviewed his name, Adam Walk, I think is his, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Walk. Mr. Walk. I interviewed Mr. Walk. And he is the business development manager for Zoltech Industries down in St. Louis, Missouri. And this is one of the big carbon fiber manufacturers in the US. And he's been staying in touch with Alberta Innovates because he's really interested in what's going on up in Calgary. And I said to him, I said, look, Alex, there we go. Alex, if the Alberta Innovates is successful and developing this, turning bitumen into carbon fiber precursor, would you build a carbon fiber plant in Alberta? And he said, well, of course you would. Because the rule of thumb in our industry is you don't ship the precursor, you put the plant next to the precursor. So now imagine we have 3 million barrels a day of bitumen. only half of which could be used for this, by the way. It's the heavy end of the barrel. So you got 1.5 million barrels a day. Do you know how much carbon fiber precursor you could make? And they think that they can make it for half the price that carbon fiber currently costs. Okay, so if you're sitting here and you're looking at the future of Alberta oil and gas, and markets look like they're going to get volatile if nothing else, but probably declining in a few years, and you're looking around, and your international markets, your markets in the United States and potentially in Asia once the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline is finished, those markets are set for decline. Would it not occur to you that maybe building domestic markets for bitumen and building a bunch of plants and the supply chains to supply those plants so that you could turn that bitumen into a really high value material might not be the way to go? Right? I mean, doesn't that, I'll borrow, from Tim Hortons in Leduc. Isn't that common sense? Right? Okay. So I gave you that example because I wanted to illustrate what I say. When I say the status quo, I mean the way we do things now. Just dig it up and sell it. And the alternative is to look for value add material, non-combustion. Post-combustion is generally how we refer to it. Post-combustion uses for Alberta's oil and gas. Now, here's another little story for you. Do you know where the Shepard power plant is in southeast Calgary?
Yes.
Of course you do. It's about a kilometer, from where I used to live in Mackenziestown, and it's very near to the old racing track out there. So, at the site of that plant, which burns natural gas and produces a lot of emissions, there is a research center, the Alberta Carbon Technology Research Conversion Center, something like that. And there's 3 or 4 companies, startups that are working there now, and they take CO2, captured CO2 from the Shepard plant, and they make stuff with it. They embed it into cement to make better cement and low emission cement. They make vodka out of it. They make cloth out of it. They do all sorts of things with it. And there's also a lab that center runs over near the University of Calgary in the Northwest that I visited. And so the point here, Nate, and this applies to the bitumen research as well, bitumen beyond combustion, they call it, is that both of those are world-class, world-leading research programs, right? When it comes to turning heavy crude into stuff, we lead. We're leading the world. When it comes to capturing CO2 and turning it into stuff, into materials, we may not be at the front of the pack, but we're right up there with the big players, and China's included. One of the scientists told me this. He said, this is a really important time for us because as these other countries, could be Saudi Arabia, could be Russia, could be US, would be the most likely one, they'll see what we're doing. It's not like this is all being done clandestine, like behind closed doors. They'll see what we're doing. They'll recognize the value. They'll throw money at it because that's what these big countries do, and we'll lose our lead. Why would we do that? Well, I'll tell you how, if it happens, I'll tell you how it's going to happen, is because it's not a priority. It's not a priority for the UCP government. It's not a priority for the oil and gas industry. It's not even it's not a priority in Ottawa. It's not, it's one of these little side hustles, that, well, if it works out, maybe we'll. That's not how we're going to succeed in an energy transition. When we have the lead in something, we ought to be pouring like hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into this stuff so that we get it commercialized and we own the market for it. So I guess anyway,
that gets to my next question is, why aren't we doing that? I mean, if there is a business case to be made potentially for this could be an industry that could potentially, I don't want to use the word replace, but I'm going to, the traditional status quo oil and gas way of doing business in Alberta. Why aren't companies jumping on this? Why do you think it is that the government isn't pursuing this more aggressively? Because it's well known that in Alberta, all of a good chunk of our revenue, I mean, our budgets are either deficit budgets or surplus budgets based on how's the price of oil and gas doing. So with that in mind, why do you think it is, if these new technologies and new developments are so promising, why do you think it is that it's not being jumped on?
Let me tell you a little story. So the last time I was in Calgary, about 2-3 weeks ago, I interviewed Professor Bob Schultz in the Haskayne School of Business, and we were talking about stripper wells and so on. And Bob starts talking about this transition oil demand scenario that he's read, that says that oil is going to grow from where it is now, which is about 102 million barrels a day. And by 2040, 2050, it's going to grow to 135 million barrels a day. And so basically it's the continuation of the status quo out for the next 20 years. But here's the thing. Here's the important part of the story. He said most of the oil guys agree with this scenario. Now, the scenario, as it turns out, was Shell's Sky 1.5 transition scenario, which came out in 2021, which is based on IEA data that was published in 2020, which is actually collected from 2018, 2019. Well, what's happened since then? We had the pandemic, the global pandemic, which is a huge shock to the global energy system and accelerated the transition. And then we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right? So now all of a sudden, what Russia taught us, and not so much here, but it certainly taught Europe, and it certainly taught the Asian countries, is that autocrats can weaponize energy. And you aren't safe. If you're an importer, if you're importing gas or oil or coal or any of all of those, then you are vulnerable to the weaponization of that energy. And with the rise of China, I mean, China's flexing its muscles on the global stage. There's plenty of countries that are really worried about that. So if what did Europe do when Vladimir Putin cut off natural gas? They adopted a strategy in May of 2022 called Repower EU, and basically it said, okay, that's fine. Here's how we're going to respond. First of all, we're going to look for alternate supplies in the short term. We're like, we got to have gas because you can't replace it overnight. So they went out and they basically sucked all the LNG out of Asia and paid a pretty penny for it. And so they got through the winter. Then they said, we're going to invest heavily in energy efficiency, which basically means a lot of electrification and insulation, ways to use energy more efficiently. The easiest way to lower the cost of energy is to use less of it and use it more efficiently. And then the third thing was, we're going to go big time into renewables and accelerate all of our targets, and we're going to generate all that much more clean electricity, and then we're going to electrify everything that much quicker. So transportation, we're going to put heat pumps in our buildings. We're going to make steel with electric process. We're going to make hydrogen. We're going to do all of this stuff. And so their response is like a model for other countries. They go, okay, well, if I'm in Africa and I've got all that sunshine, why wouldn't I go in with solar? Right? Or if I'm Vietnam, all of these countries, everybody now has got it. And that in the energy insecurity that Vladimir Putin created with his invasion of Ukraine has backfired on him spectacularly, because what it did is it goosed the energy transition. And so all of that stuff isn't well understood here. The guys the CEOs that are running these companies They don't talk to Beijing. They don't talk to, Paris or they talk to Houston, where it's all about oil and gas. That's where the information flows. That's where the relationship exists in Calgary, is with Houston. It's not with all of these other. I'm shocked, and I'm at the lack of understanding of the energy transition, clean energy technologies that I see in the leadership in the oil and gas industry and in our political leadership and in our business leadership. It's astonishing. We're really insular and provincial. We're inward looking. We're navel gazers. We're not looking out at that big world and acquainting ourselves with what's going on in the energy transition. And that's why these CEOs that are confidently predicting, oh yeah, we're going to have growth for the next 20 years. It'll be energy diversification, not energy transition. They are going to be so surprised, because it's going to bite them in the ass. And this is my message over and over and over again for Alberta, is you have a moment now. Take it. You have the opportunity to change course, to run a parallel stream where you develop these new markets so that when the old ones begin to decline, you can transition from one to the other. Now is the time. If you wait 5 years, if you wait 7 years, if you wait 10 years, it's going to be too late. I'll tell you another little story. I was interviewing, he's got an African name and I always get it wrong. Amofi, doesn't matter. Bloomberg NEF's head of mining and commodities, wonderful guy. And we were talking about Alberta. We were saying, look, we're saying, Amofi, if Alberta's got critical minerals, it could be a place where you could build battery metal processing, because that's what China controls 80% of when it comes to batteries, right? It's the weak link in the supply chain. And he said, yes, absolutely. Alberta could do that. And I said, well, how much time have they got? 7 years? Surely they've got 10 years, right? And he goes, no, they've got 2 to 5 years. And the reason for that is because all of these other countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, they've been at this a long time. They've been growing up in the shadow of the Chinese economy, and they've been watching and they've been learning. And to some extent, China has been investing in their infrastructure and their economies. They want what we want, and they're pursuing it really aggressively. Like Indonesia is using its dominance in the nickel market to leverage battery plants, right? So these guys get it, and we have competitors, and in a way that we didn't have with like heavy crude oil and some of our other resources. In the clean energy and clean energy technology space, Alberta has competitors. They're ahead of us. We're behind.
It sounds like we haven't
Well, look, if I was having this conversation 3 years ago, 4 years ago, well, in 2019, I had a UCP candidate DM me on Facebook, and he said, you can spell it with a capital E, you can spell it with a capital T, but there is no energy transition. It's a figment of your imagination. It's an invention of the eco-terror, blah, 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 blah. 4 years ago, that was a common attitude. And we look back on that and it's ridiculous. How could anybody believe that? Right? But so Alberta has come a long way in 4 years from that sort of really backwards attitude. And there's a lot more. I was at a hydrogen convention in February it was March. It doesn't matter. Anyway, hydrogen convention in Edmonton, talked to, Mayor Sohi, talked to Mayor Love in Strathcona County, talked to a bunch of business leaders and stuff. And the sea change in attitude is noticeable. The leadership in Alberta is starting to get it. What they don't understand is how far behind they are. They don't know what they don't know, right? Yeah. And that's the problem, is that other countries are having these really vigorous, informed debates about, new technologies, new markets, new materials, new this, new that, new research and development, science and capital flows and all of that. We're not having those conversations in Alberta, or they're very early on and they're very nascent, we'll say. And Alberta needs to get its shit together and become a leader in some of this stuff, like bitumen beyond combustion and captured CO2 into materials, or it's going to miss its opportunity. The window of opportunity is going to close. And so what does the premier do? She's still pimping LNG. You know, why are we trying to be 13th or 15th in the world in a 20th century fuel? Why are we doing that? We spend all of our political capital, we spend all of our time talking about it, about the past. We're basically driving by the rearview mirror again. We need to stop that.
And this is where I'm going to try to bring you back to Unethical Oil Part 2, because I want to talk about the stakes a little bit. To sort of recap, the exponential growth thing is happening. Alberta does have some opportunities where we can, if we start to hurry, we can potentially replace some of the revenue that we're likely going to use when this transition, that we're likely going to lose when this transition happens. But it's not just a question of the revenue piece. It's a question of, you know, we as kids we're all taught that we have to clean up our rooms, we have to clean up our messes, otherwise we don't get a cookie. But the problem that we're experiencing in Alberta, starting to experience and are going to experience much, much deeper, it sounds like from the tone of your column, is that we haven't cleaned our rooms at all, really. We've done a little bit of like stuffing it into the closet, but we haven't really cleaned our rooms, and we have effectively $250 billion in cleanup that's still required to happen. But if the oil companies decide not to do that, there's not much that we can do, right?
Part 2 of the Unethical Oil series, part 1 basically just sets out the argument. You know, ethical oil and Ezra Levant, and we're, you know, this idea that because Alberta is in Canada, Canada's a leading Western democracy. We're not, you know, throwing people off a building, gay people off of buildings, or chopping people's heads off, that somehow that makes us superior and that makes our oil superior. And so Ezra wrote this ethical oil book in 2010. And ever since then, it's the ethical oil narrative has grown. So now not only are we ethical, now we're the most environmentally responsible oil in the world. We're the cleanest oil in the world. And anybody who knows, like if you spend any time, you know, looking at the data, you know, this is bunk. I mean, it's not true. The question is, how did we get here? And as a journalist, I kept asking the question, why? And so I wrote 12,500 words. It's not the easiest read, folks, but I answered the question why. And so let me explain to you why. So basically, the industry in Alberta really got started in the 1930s, and of course, in 1947 there was the you know, Turner Valley one and the big gusher, and that's the start of the modern industry. But from the very beginning, Alberta did what pretty much every other jurisdiction in North America did, was it Texas, or whether it was Pennsylvania, whether it was Oklahoma, and that is they prioritized the profitability and growth of the industry, the attraction of capital, because that's good for the business community, the creation of jobs, and especially this is true in Alberta's case, the generation of government revenue. Those are the four priorities. Environmental liabilities, cleaning up your wells and your facilities and your pipelines, was down the list. And the idea was that there would always be time to go back and clean them up. And that oil companies would be responsible and they'd get around to it eventually. So starting in the early days, and here's another important point that I don't think that I really took me a little while to twig to this. If you're going to require that a well be cleaned up, that eventually it gets sealed and plugged, and then the site gets reclaimed and it gets brought back to the state where, you know, the landowner can then go back to using the land normally. If you're going to do that and you don't collect money at the beginning when the well is drilled, then you spend the rest of that well's life trying to figure out how to get reclamation paid for, how to get cleanup paid for. And that is, so what happened in the early days is that the Alberta regulators collected a very small amount of security. And then in 1986, they made a fateful decision. And they said, we are no longer going to collect security against future well liabilities because, you know, it's really, we're not collecting enough and the industry doesn't want to pay more. So we're going to stop taking security and we're going to put in place a well abandonment fund. Now, there's a thread that runs through, and it's still there, which is Alberta it really believes that oil companies are the good guys and that they will do the right thing. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's not the truth. And they very rarely do the right thing. And so what they did is they went to this abandonment fund. They said, okay, so look, if a company goes bankrupt and there's nobody around, it literally becomes an orphan, right? No parent that owns the well, then we'll have this fund and the industry will contribute to it. And we'll use that to fix these wells, because we really expect that all these other companies that are drilling wells, that they will be responsible and they'll reclaim them. And there's a great a letter in 1995 from the Energy and Utilities Board, which is the regulator at that time, where they described, this is what we thought. Boy, were we wrong. Because that's not what oil companies did. You know what they did? They practiced something called liability dumping. And it's not just here in Alberta, it's gone on all over the place. And that is, so you're a bigger oil company and you drill a well and then you produce that well for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever. You make a lot of money off it. It's very productive. But then it begins, the reservoir, the formation that you're pumping from begins to peter out and the production falls. And you get to the point where you say, you know what, we don't want to produce this well anymore. We're going to sell it to somebody else. And so you sell it to a smaller company. Now you might sell it to a little company, but often you sell it to a smaller company and then eventually they sell it to a smaller company and then they sell it to another smaller company. And then you get down to what in the US is called stripper wells. And stripper wells in Alberta are considered like under 10 barrels a day, usually around 2, 3, 4, or 5 barrels a day. And they're run by mom and pop operations like Ted Gladsis, who used to be the spokesperson for the head of their industry here in Alberta. And these guys would go out there just literally bootstrapping entrepreneurs, the hard-bitten Albertans out and, working 20 hours a day and doing, that's what these guys were. And they made those little wells work, but a lot of them would go bankrupt. And then so you'd go from an active well, then you'd go into the inactive category. And what happened over the years is that inactive category grew and grew and grew and grew. So in 1995, it was about 30,000. Then they brought in this rule and they said, you know what? We're going to bring in something called the license liability rating, LLR. And every month, we're going to calculate the assets and the liabilities of every oil company in Alberta. And if you have a rating of 1, that means that your assets and your liabilities equal each other. They're equal. But for an oil, if you're an oil company, that's not a good situation. You're almost at the point of insolvency at that point. So if you slip below 1, we'll intervene. We'll ask you for security, or we'll demand that you sell some wells to bring your rating up above 1. And then between 1 and 2 is kind of the danger zone. You might slip into below 1. You might get into trouble. So they brought this system in 2001, and I'm telling you, Nate, I have in the part 2, I have a graph, and it bumps along like this until 2001 when they brought in LLR. and then it shoots up like a hockey stick. The LLR system was one of the most futile. It was awful. It just was an utter failure. And between 1995 and 2000 and let me see, it'd be about 2007, 2010, went up to 90,000 wells. Now, these are wells. They're not orphan wells. There's a licensee attached to them, but very often that licensee is broke, or it's insolvent, or it's basically just now a paper company. There's nobody working for it. It's just somebody pays the annual fees every year to keep it from being struck from the register. And at the same time as they brought in the LLR system, they brought in the Orphan Well Association, right? Everybody knows about the Orphan Well Association. But the Orphan Well Association only closes wells where the owner, the company that owns it, is bankrupt. Basically, they failed. They've been struck from the corporate register. At that point, then those wells can be transferred into the Orphan Well Association. The industry pays an annual levy. This year, it's $135 million. And then the Orphan Well Association closes that well. Here's the problem. Those inactive wells are really, most of them, orphans in name. They're de facto orphans. They're essentially orphans. They're never going to go back into production. They're never going to be unsuspended. They're waiting there, hanging over the industry, and eventually somebody's going to have to reclaim them. But who's going to reclaim them? Because the companies are not setting aside, the companies aren't doing it. In the documents that we have quoted in part one, the regulator, now the Alberta Energy Regulator, says very clearly that the industry has no interest in reclaiming, keeping up with reclamation. In fact, what they do is there's different types of wells, right? So if you've got some of them are dry holes, you never produce any hydrocarbons, doesn't cost you much. They focus on that. Gas wells, there's no contamination, nothing leaks in a gas well, so that's low cost. You'd focus on that. But the contaminated, the oil wells that leak, that contaminate the soil on the farmland, those ones they don't do because they're too expensive, right? So the system gets gamed. That's the problem. And so now we've got ourselves into a position where we've got 85 or 80, about 83,000 inactive wells right now that are de facto orphans. Then we have another 155,000 active wells, but 61% of those, which is about 95,000 wells, are stripper wells, what the AER calls marginal producers. So in the not too distant future, those are going to become inactive wells. Because so if you have 83 and 95,000, what do you get? 178,000? Is my math correct? And now right. So now you know why. And then on top of that, there's 440,000 kilometers of pipeline. Now the pipes stay in the ground, but they need to be cleaned up and they need to be properly decommissioned. Plus you've got facilities, right? That, like gas plants and stuff. And there are 90,000 of those. And the AER has no idea how many of those have been reclaimed. And so the estimate now is to clean all of that mess up is between $100 and $130 billion. Who's going to pay? If we know, and if we take my position, which is arguing that the global markets for our oil are going to begin to decline over the next 5, 6, 7 years, 10 years at the most, I think we can all do that math. And it's a crisis. It's a crisis in the making. And the government, and fairness to Smith and the UCP, they did bring in a new liability framework in 2020, and they brought in the inventory reduction program in 2022 that has a mandatory spend. So now the industry is spending, $600, $700, $800 million a year, which is far more than they spent in the past. Kudos to them. But that's basically treading water. That's all that is. They're making very little headway on, that the categories that are going to be that are problems or will be soon be problems. Anyway, so Nate, I apologize for rambling on, but that essentially, I've laid out the landscape and it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, I got a couple questions based on that. I mean, I think the biggest question that comes to mind for me is this: you've laid out a potential pathway wherein Alberta could access bitumen for products still, I'll say. There's a pathway where industry could still be pulling bitumen out and doing stuff with it. I guess the question that I find myself asking is, and I kind of tried to get at this earlier, is why would they? I mean, we're talking. You just finished a pretty extensive commentary on the moral leanings of a lot of these oil and gas companies. I mean, the fact that there's stuff like liability dumping going on, there's very clearly a pursuit within these companies for what's going to give us the easiest money the quickest, and that's understandable because they do have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So if there's clearly a pathway to still using the bitumen for other products, but it seems like the window to be able to do that and have any kind of financial return is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the question that I find myself left with is, why would these oil companies or energy companies or whatever we want to call them, why would they invest in these sorts of things, in this sort of product development, to the scale that would be required to replace the void that's going to be left if your projections around the transition are anywhere near accurate? Why would they do that? Why don't they just go down to somewhere where you can get oil cheaper or other forms of energy cheaper and more reliably and say, so long, Alberta, thanks for all the fish?
And that's the end of part one of our conversation with Markham Hislop. Stay tuned for part two, where we get the answer to that question. We get into carbon capture and we talk about why it is that the NDP can't seem to address the issue of Alberta's energy future in a way that resonates with Albertans.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdowns audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.